The first time I realized my family had already decided my place, it happened in a law office I wasn't supposed to be in. My name wasn't on the agenda. And yet, everything being discussed belonged to me. Before I go any further, if you're listening to this and you've ever been quietly erased by the people who benefited from your effort, stay with me. Like the story, leave a comment, subscribe if this feels familiar. What happened next changed my life in ways no argument ever could. My name is Claire Holloway, and at the time this began, I was 31 years old. I was sitting in a leather chair outside Conference Room B at Dalton, Meyer & Frost, a private estate law firm in Westchester County, New York, staring at a brass plaque that listed partners I'd never met. Inside that room were my parents, my younger brother, and my grandmother's attorney. They didn't know I was there. They hadn't invited me. They assumed I wouldn't show up. I had built my life around that assumption. The meeting was about my grandmother, Margaret Holloway, who had suffered a mild stroke 3 weeks earlier. She was stable, sharp, still very much alive. But suddenly, everyone cared deeply about paperwork, especially my father, Thomas Holloway, who had not visited her once in the hospital. I worked in logistics operations, a senior planning role at a regional supply chain firm based in Newark, New Jersey. At 31, I managed distribution strategy for 5 warehouses, oversaw contracts worth $12 million annually, and was known for fixing problems no one else wanted to touch. In my family, that translated to dependable, quiet, useful, not important. The meeting wasn't supposed to include me because, as my mother liked to say, Claire doesn't need to worry about these things. What she meant was, Claire doesn't get a say. I only knew about the meeting because my grandmother had called me the night before. Her voice had been steady, alert. Claire, she said, your father thinks I don't notice what's happening. I asked her what she meant. He's rearranging things, she replied, and he thinks I won't ask questions. That was how Margaret Holloway operated. She never accused. She observed. She told me the name of the firm, the time of the meeting. I didn't tell them you're coming, she added. I want to see what they do. I drove up the next morning without telling anyone. Not to confront, to confirm. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's just discussed when you're not in the room. Through the closed door, I heard my brother's voice first. Ethan Holloway, 27, charming, unemployed by choice, and my parents' favorite investment. So once it's finalized, Ethan was saying, it'll be cleaner if it's just in one name. My father responded immediately. That's what we think too. Less confusion. Confusion. That was the word they used when they meant resistance. The lawyer, Richard Dalton, spoke next. Mrs. Holloway's current will divides the estate evenly between her 2 grandchildren, he said. Any change would require her direct authorization. My mother, Linda Holloway, sighed audibly. She's tired, she said. And Claire wouldn't even want the responsibility. That was when my hand tightened around my phone. They weren't asking what I wanted. They were deciding what I deserved. I stepped away from the door before they could see my shadow. I didn't need to hear more. I had heard enough. I drove straight to my grandmother's house in Scarsdale, the same house she had lived in for 42 years. The one my parents already referred to as Ethan's future place. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table when I arrived, reading the paper, glasses low on her nose. She looked up and smiled. So, she said, did they forget you again? I didn't answer right away. I sat down across from her and folded my hands. They're trying to remove me from the will, I said. She nodded once. Good, she said. Now we know. That was Margaret Holloway in a sentence. Not angry, not surprised. Accurate. She reached into a drawer and slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents I'd never seen. Old account statements, property records, a business loan from 15 years ago. My name was on all of it. Your father used my credit to start his company, she said, and your salary kept it afloat when he couldn't make payroll. I looked up at her. You never told me. You never asked, she replied gently, and they never wanted you to know. That was the moment the small thing became something else. I wasn't being excluded because I lacked value. I was being excluded because my value threatened their control. I drove home that night and didn't sleep, not because I was hurt, because I was calculating. The stroke hadn't taken Margaret's mind, but it had revealed something else. Time. And how quickly people rearrange the truth when they think the clock is on their side. By morning, I knew this wasn't about inheritance. It was about erasure. And I had spent my entire life being trained to accept it quietly. But that training had limits, and I had just found them. End of chapter 1. I didn't confront anyone after that meeting. Not my parents, not my brother. I went back to my apartment in Harrison, New Jersey, poured a glass of water, and sat at the small kitchen table where I usually reviewed shipping forecasts and contract delays. That night, instead of numbers, I replayed memories. Not dramatic ones, ordinary ones. The kind that only makes sense after you finally see the pattern. I had always been the child who adjusted. When I was 9, my parents moved us from Rye to a smaller house in White Plains, so my father, Thomas Holloway, could pour more money into his startup. My brother Ethan cried about leaving his friends. My mother, Linda Holloway, packed his room first so he would feel settled. No one asked how I felt. I learned early that silence was efficient. At 15, when I got my first part-time job shelving inventory at a local hardware store, my father told people it was good discipline for Claire. When Ethan quit 2 summer internships in a row, they said he was finding himself. Same behavior, different language. By 22, I was already paying my own tuition gaps, my own rent, my own insurance. I never asked them for help because they'd trained me not to expect it. Independence wasn't a choice in our family. It was my assigned role, and I performed it well. That's how I ended up in logistics. After graduating from Rutgers, I took a junior planning role at a third-party distribution firm that was hemorrhaging money. Within 4 years, I was managing routes across 3 states, cutting losses by 18%, and negotiating vendor contracts people twice my age avoided. When something was broken, I was useful. When something needed recognition, I was inconvenient. That distinction followed me everywhere. At family dinners, Ethan talked about ideas. Not plans, ideas. My parents leaned forward, nodding, encouraging. When I mentioned a promotion or a new project, my mother would say, "That's nice, Claire," and change the subject. I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. Not because I needed praise, because being consistently ignored teaches you something dangerous. That your absence is preferable to your presence. The day after the law firm meeting, my father called me. "Your grandmother is worrying too much," Thomas said, skipping any greeting. "We're just organizing things." "I know," I replied. There was a pause. "You didn't need to involve yourself," he added. That was the phrase he always used when I got too close to something that mattered. Involve yourself. As if I were a guest in my own family. "I didn't," I said calmly. She called me. Another pause. Longer this time. "Well," he said, "these decisions are complicated. And frankly, Ethan has more time to manage estate matters." I pictured my brother asleep past noon in my parents' guest room. "Managing isn't the same as understanding," I said. Thomas exhaled sharply. "This isn't a debate," he said. "We're handling it." After the call ended, I sat still for a long time, because something had shifted. Not anger, clarity. I realized I had spent years proving I was capable, hoping competence would eventually earn me trust. But in my family, trust wasn't based on ability. It was based on alignment. Ethan aligned with their comfort. I aligned with their convenience. And convenience is always the first thing people are willing to discard once it challenges them. That afternoon, I went back to see my grandmother. Margaret Holloway was in her living room. Paperwork spread neatly across the coffee table. She wore the same cardigan she always did, her posture straight, despite the cane resting beside her chair. "They think you won't notice," I said. "They think I won't remember," she replied. She handed me a document. It was a loan agreement from 17 years earlier, her signature, my father's company name, and a repayment clause that had never been honored. "You were still in middle school," she said, "but your summer savings bonds were listed as collateral." I felt my chest tighten. "They used my name," I said. "Yes," she replied. "And they assumed you'd never question it." That assumption had protected them for decades. It wouldn't anymore. Margaret reached for my hand. "I need you to promise me something," she said. I looked at her. "Don't fight them emotionally," she continued. "Fight them correctly." That was when I understood what she was asking. Not revenge. Precision. I left her house with copies of documents, dates, and a sense of purpose that didn't feel loud or righteous. It felt methodical, familiar, like work. That night, as I organized the files on my laptop, a notification popped up. An email from Richard Dalton, the estate attorney. Subject line: clarification requested. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Because when people who exclude you suddenly want clarity, it's rarely accidental. And I knew whatever came next would force me out of the role they'd assigned me, whether they were ready or not. I didn't reply to Richard Dalton's email right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, because timing matters when power is shifting. I went to work the next morning like nothing had happened. The warehouse in Elizabeth, New Jersey, was already loud when I arrived. Forklifts weaving between pallets, supervisors arguing over delayed shipments from Baltimore. This was familiar, predictable. Systems failing in ways that could be measured and fixed. I reviewed route performance, flagged 2 vendors for breach of contract, approved an emergency reroute that would cost an extra $36,000, but prevent a 2-day shutdown. By noon, the problem was contained. That was the difference between chaos and control. You didn't panic, you didn't announce. You acted early and quietly. I wondered when my family had stopped understanding that. Around 2 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother, Linda Holloway. "Your father says you've been asking questions." I stared at the screen. I typed back one sentence. "Margaret asked me to." The response came almost instantly. "This really isn't your place, Claire." There it was. Not wrong. Not inappropriate. Not your place. I didn't answer. Because if you explain yourself every time someone questions your right to exist in a space, you'll spend your whole life negotiating permission you never needed. I waited until after dinner to respond to Richard Dalton. My reply was brief, polite, precise. "I am Margaret Holloway's granddaughter. She requested that I review any changes to her estate. Please advise how you intend to proceed. No accusations, no emotion, just presence." The reply came within 10 minutes. "We should schedule a call." I didn't. Instead, I forwarded the email to my grandmother. She called me an hour later. "He sounds nervous," she said calmly. "That means he understands the risk." "Do you want me to push?" I asked. "I want you to observe," she replied. "They'll reveal more if they think you're still uncertain." She had always been like this. Strategic without being cruel. Patient without being passive. That patience had kept her alive in a family that mistook kindness for weakness. The next few days unfolded exactly as she predicted. My father began calling more often. Short calls, vague updates, phrases like, "We're just being careful and everything's under control." My brother Ethan Holloway texted me for the first time in months. "Hey, heard things are tense. No need to stress Grandma out." Stress her out, as if I were the problem. I didn't respond. Instead, I requested my credit report. I hadn't planned to. It wasn't part of any strategy yet. It was instinct. The same instinct that told me to double-check inventory when numbers looked too clean. The report arrived that night. And there it was. An old lien, long closed, paid off on paper, but not by the company, by a trust account bearing my name. I stared at the screen, the numbers suddenly sharper than anything I'd seen in weeks. They hadn't just used my name. They had used my future. I didn't feel angry. I felt embarrassed, not by what they'd done, by how long it had taken me to look. I went back through old documents, bank statements I'd barely glanced at in my 20s. Tax summaries my father had always insisted on handling when I was younger. A pattern emerged. Small transfers. Quiet reimbursements. Lines itemized vaguely enough to pass casual inspection. I had been the safety net they never told me existed. And like any safety net, I was only visible when something fell. On Friday evening, my father asked me to come to dinner. "Your mother wants us all together," he said. "Let's clear the air." Clear the air was his way of resetting the narrative. I agreed. Not because I wanted peace, because I wanted to see how far they would go now that I was paying attention. Dinner was at my parents' house in White Plains, the same dining room where my achievements had always been acknowledged, just long enough to be dismissed. My mother had cooked too much food. That was always a sign she was anxious. Ethan was already there, leaning back in his chair, relaxed in a way that only comes from never being questioned. "Hey," he said casually. "Didn't expect you." I met his eyes. "I know," I said. My father cleared his throat before anyone sat down. "Let's not make this a trial," he said. "We're family. Family. The word landed differently now. I'm not making anything a trial, I replied. I'm asking for transparency. My mother's hand froze mid-motion. About what? She asked. I didn't answer her. I looked at my father. Why was my name used as collateral for your business loan? I asked. The silence was immediate. Not confusion, recognition. That was a long time ago, Thomas said carefully. And everything was repaid. By me, I replied. Without my consent. Ethan shifted in his chair. This is getting dramatic, he muttered. I turned to him. Stay out of it, I said calmly. He blinked, surprised. No one had ever said that to him before. My father leaned forward. You're overreacting, he said. We did what was necessary. For you, I replied. My mother's voice shook slightly. You've always been so independent, she said. We didn't think you'd mind. That sentence explained my entire childhood. They hadn't excluded me because I was weak. They had exploited me because I was strong. I stood up. I'm not here to argue, I said. I'm here to inform you. Both of my parents looked at me now. I won't be signing off on any changes to Grandma's estate, I continued. And I've requested a full accounting. My father's face darkened. You don't have the authority, he said. I picked up my bag. I do, I replied. She gave it to me. As I walked toward the door, my mother spoke. Claire, she said, if you do this, you'll tear this family apart. I paused, not because I was unsure, because the truth deserved to be said clearly. This family has been intact at my expense for years, I said. I'm done paying for that. I left without waiting for a response. That night, my grandmother called me. They'll escalate now, she said. Are you ready? I looked at the documents spread across my table. The patterns finally visible. Yes, I replied, because I finally know what I'm standing on. She exhaled softly. Good, she said, because once you stop being convenient, people reveal how dangerous they really are. And I had the feeling that the next move wouldn't be quiet at all. The first legal letter arrived on a Monday. Certified mail. Plain envelope. No return address I recognized. But I knew before opening it that it wasn't routine. Routine doesn't knock like that. Routine doesn't announce itself. I stood in my apartment hallway for a full minute before tearing it open. Inside was a notice from Dalton, Meyer, and Frost, formally advising that all communication regarding Margaret Holloway's estate would now be handled exclusively through my father, Thomas Holloway, as primary family representative. Primary. The word was doing a lot of work. They weren't just excluding me. They were trying to reframe authority before I could challenge it. I sat down on the edge of the couch and read it again, slower this time. No mention of Margaret's consent. No acknowledgement of my documented involvement. Just a quiet administrative maneuver designed to make me disappear politely. It almost worked. Almost. I called my grandmother immediately. They sent me a notice, I said. They're cutting me out. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed. Not bitterly, not nervously, amused. So that's their move, she said. Faster than I expected. You knew this was coming, I said. I knew they'd try, she replied. I didn't know how sloppy they'd be. That word stuck with me. Sloppy. Because my father prided himself on control, on appearances, on never being caught unprepared. And yet, he had underestimated one thing. Documentation. Did you sign anything new? I asked. No, she said flatly. And I won't. Good, I replied. Then they don't have standing. She exhaled. I want you to come with me tomorrow, she said. Different firm. That was how Margaret Holloway fought. Not with accusations. With replacements. The next morning, I took the day off work and drove her to Kensington and Row, a boutique estate and fiduciary litigation firm in Manhattan. The lobby was smaller, quieter, less polished, which told me immediately they spent less time selling comfort and more time preparing for conflict. We were greeted by Daniel Rowe, a gray-haired attorney with sharp eyes and the kind of voice that never rushed. I've reviewed the documents you sent, he said once we were seated, including the loan agreements, trust disbursements, and attempted representation change. He looked directly at me. You weren't just excluded, he continued. You were strategically sidelined. My grandmother nodded. That's what Daniel folded his hands. Mrs. Holloway, he said, your family appears to be operating under the assumption that proximity equals authority. And it doesn't, she replied. No, he agreed. Consent does. He explained their position clearly. No legal jargon designed to impress, just facts. The will was still valid. The power of attorney my father claimed didn't exist. The attempted shift in representation could be challenged. Aggressively. "What are my options?" Margaret asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "We freeze changes," he said. "We demand a full accounting. And if they continue to obstruct, we file." I watched my grandmother carefully. She didn't flinch. "Do it," she said. Daniel nodded once. Then he turned to me. "You'll be our point of contact," he said. My father had spent years insisting I didn't need to be involved. Now a court was about to disagree. As we left the office, Margaret squeezed my hand. "They thought they could lock you out," she said. "They forgot something." "What?" I asked. "They raised you to understand systems," she replied, "not emotions." That afternoon, my phone started ringing. Calls from my mother, from my father, from numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. Because when people panic, they reveal more through what they send than what they say. And the messages came fast. "Thomas, you've gone too far." "Linda, why are you doing this to us?" "Ethan, this is going to hurt everyone." I read them once, then archived them. That evening, Daniel emailed me a draft of the formal notice. Clear, firm, impossible to misinterpret. They were no longer in control of the timeline. They were reacting. I forwarded it to my grandmother. Her reply was one line: "Good. Let them feel it." I went to bed that night, knowing something irreversible had started. Not a fight, a process. And processes, once triggered, don't care about family loyalty. They care about facts. The next morning, my father showed up at my apartment unannounced. I saw him through the peephole. Standing there, coat buttoned wrong, jaw tight, holding a folder that looked heavier than paper. I didn't open the door. Because the moment you stop letting people in, they start realizing how much access they were given without earning it. And I had a feeling this was the last quiet moment before everything turned public. My father stood outside my apartment door for nearly 10 minutes. I know, because I counted the footsteps in the hallway. The shift of his weight. The quiet knock that followed the first loud one, as if volume had been a mistake he could correct. I didn't open the door. Eventually, he left the folder leaning against the wall, right where I'd see it if I stepped out. That was his way of saying, "This isn't over," without having to say it out loud. I waited another hour before retrieving it. Inside were copies of documents I already had: loan statements, old trust summaries. A handwritten note on top, in my father's familiar block letters. "We need to talk. This is getting out of hand." Out of hand. As if the hand had ever been mine. I didn't respond. I didn't call. I didn't send the folder back. I forwarded it to Daniel Rowe. His reply came 20 minutes later. "Helpful. Confirms timeline discrepancies. Keep everything." That night, my mother tried a different approach. She called instead of texting. When I didn't answer, she left a voicemail. "Claire," Linda said, her voice soft in the way it only became when she wanted something. "We're worried about you. This lawyer is filling your head with ideas that aren't good for the family. You don't have to do this." I listened once, then I deleted it. Not because it didn't hurt, because it was familiar. Concern had always arrived in my family, only when control was threatened. The next morning, Daniel filed the notice. A formal demand for a full accounting of all trust activity tied to Margaret Holloway's estate, including any use of collateral connected to my name. The response was immediate. Not from the firm, from my brother. Ethan Holloway called me from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, mostly out of curiosity. "Are you proud of yourself?" he asked without greeting. "Of what?" I replied. "Of blowing everything up," he said. "Dad's freaking out. Grandma's stressed. Mom hasn't slept." I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the coffee maker drip slowly. "You didn't call when I was paying off debt I didn't authorize," I said. "Why now?" "That was business," he snapped. "No," I replied calmly. "It was theft." Silence. Then a laugh, short and disbelieving. "You're being dramatic," Ethan said. "This is how families work. You help each other." "Only one of us was helped," I said. "And it wasn't me." He exhaled sharply. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "We can fix this. Dad said maybe we revise things. Maybe you get something later. But pushing lawyers is going to cost you." "Cost me what?" I asked. "Our relationship," he said. I almost smiled. "You can't lose what you never had," I replied, and ended the call. That afternoon, Daniel called. "They're stalling," he said. Partial disclosures, missing dates. We expected this. What happens next? I asked. If they don't comply fully, he replied, we file in surrogate's court. Court. The word felt heavy, but not frightening, just final. I drove to my grandmother's house that evening. Margaret was sitting by the window, watching the light fade across the lawn. She looked smaller than she had weeks ago, the cane closer now, her movements slower. But her eyes were clear. They're angry, she said before I could speak. That means they're afraid. I didn't want this to exhaust you, I said. She turned to look at me. Claire, she said, I am tired because I've spent decades pretending not to see what was happening. Not because of this. She reached for my hand. They counted on you staying quiet, she continued. On you being reasonable. That was their strategy. I nodded. And now? I asked. Now, the next day, my workplace called me into HR. Not for discipline, for questions. Apparently, my father had contacted someone in the company's extended network, hinting that I might be distracted and emotionally compromised. The implication was subtle. The intent was not. I sat across from the HR director, Monica Reyes, and explained the situation calmly. No details, no drama. Just enough context to make the motive clear. She listened without interrupting. Then she closed her folder. Thank you for telling me, she said. If anyone contacts us again about your personal life, please let me know. That won't be tolerated. I walked out with my position intact. But the message was clear. They were escalating. That night, I received an email from Dalton, Meyer, and Frost. Subject: Compliance Update. Inside was a formal refusal to release certain records, citing confidentiality and family discretion. Daniel responded within the hour. His reply was one paragraph long. We will be filing. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from anxiety, from anticipation. Because once legal action begins, people stop pretending. The following morning, my mother showed up at my office. Not reception, my desk. She stood there, pale, clutching her purse like a shield. Can we talk? She asked. Every head nearby turned. This was intentional. I stood slowly. Yes, I said, but not here. We walked outside. She didn't waste time. You're humiliating us, Linda said. Do you understand what people are saying? I do, I replied. They think we're monsters, she whispered. I looked at her. They're starting to see the truth, I said. There's a difference. Her eyes filled with tears. You've always been so strong, she said. Why can't you just let this go? Because strength had never been permission to be used. Because if I let this go, I said quietly, I'll spend the rest of my life teaching people they can erase me without consequence. She stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. You're choosing this over us, she said. No, I replied. I'm choosing myself. You chose yourselves a long time ago. She didn't follow me back inside. 2 days later, Daniel filed the petition. Surrogate's Court, Westchester County, public record. Once filed, it couldn't be undone. My father called that night. I let it ring. Because when you push someone out of the shadows, the light doesn't ask for permission. And I knew the next chapter wouldn't be handled behind closed doors anymore. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. Not because the system moved slowly, but because it moved deliberately. Paper had to be served, responses filed, positions clarified. Once that clock started, no one could pretend this was a family misunderstanding anymore. It was a legal dispute, and that changed how everyone behaved. My father stopped calling. Completely. No messages, no threats. Silence from someone who had always filled space with authority felt less like restraint and more like recalculation. My mother tried once more. She sent an email this time. Long, carefully written. Full of phrases like unintended consequences and lasting damage and we can still fix this. She CC'd my brother. I forwarded it to Daniel Rowe without replying. He called me that afternoon. They're trying to reframe the narrative, he said, from misconduct to miscommunication. Will it work? I asked. No, he replied. Not with documents. That was the thing my family never understood about systems. You can't charm a process. You can't guilt it. You can only meet its requirements or fail them. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, more information surfaced. Records Daniel subpoenaed showed that my father's company had used trust-backed credit not once, but 4 times over a 10-year span. Each time, the liability had been quietly shifted. Each time, my name had appeared somewhere it shouldn't have. None of it was dramatic. All of it was intentional. Daniel laid it out during one of our prep meetings. This wasn't a single decision, he said. It was a pattern, and patterns are hard to explain away. What about Ethan? I asked. He benefited indirectly, Daniel replied. But the filings show your father was the driver. That didn't surprise me. Ethan had always been the outcome, not the architect. The night before the hearing, I stayed at my grandmother's house. Margaret Holloway sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd first shown me the documents weeks earlier. She looked tired now. Not weak, just aware of the weight of time. They're going to be angry tomorrow, she said. Not at me, at you. I know, I replied. Are you ready for that? She asked. I thought about it. About the years of dismissal, the quiet assumptions, the way my usefulness had been mistaken for consent. Yes, I said, because anger means they've lost control. She nodded. That's when people tell the truth, she said. Not the truth they want to believe. The truth they can't hide anymore. The courtroom in White Plains was smaller than I expected. No grandeur, no spectacle. Just wood benches, fluorescent lights, and the soft shuffle of paperwork. This wasn't theater. It was process. My parents arrived together. My father, Thomas Holloway, looked composed in the way men do when they believe authority will protect them. My mother, Linda Holloway, avoided my eyes. Ethan came separately, late. He took a seat behind them and checked his phone like this was a meeting he hadn't chosen to attend. Daniel sat beside me, calm, organized, already flipping through tabs. When the judge entered, the room settled into silence. The hearing began with procedural statements: scope, authority, standing. Then Daniel spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He presented facts. Dates, amounts, signatures. He showed how collateral had been pledged without disclosure, how repayments had bypassed the company and landed in trust structures tied to my name, how my exclusion from decision-making coincided with moments of financial strain. The judge listened, asked questions, took notes. When my father's attorney responded, the tone shifted. They leaned heavily on intent, on family dynamics, on misunderstanding. This was never meant to harm, the attorney said. It was a matter of convenience. The word landed in the room like a confession. Convenience. I felt Daniel shift slightly beside me. The judge looked up. Convenient for whom? She asked. There was no good answer. When my father was asked to speak, he stood slowly. He talked about responsibility, about providing, about difficult choices made under pressure. He did not look at me. When he finished, the judge turned to my grandmother. Mrs. Holloway, she said, do you wish to add anything? Margaret stood with effort, leaning on her cane. Yes, she said. I wish to clarify something. The room leaned in. My son believes he was protecting the family, she continued. But what he was protecting was his position. He assumed my granddaughter's silence meant approval. She turned her head and looked directly at him. It did not. The judge nodded. That's clear, she said. The ruling wasn't delivered that day. Hearings like this rarely end neatly, but the direction was unmistakable. Full control removed. Outside the courtroom, my mother approached me. Her voice was low, urgent. You didn't have to let it go this far, she said. I met her eyes. You didn't have to let it start, I replied. She looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time, I saw fear. Not of the court, of losing the version of reality where I absorbed consequences quietly. Ethan passed by without speaking. My father lingered near the exit. Claire, he said, finally. I stopped, but didn't turn. This isn't over, he said. I faced him. No, I replied calmly. This is just no longer yours to control. That afternoon, Daniel called me once I was home. They're scrambling, he said, trying to negotiate privately. What do you recommend? I asked. We don't, he replied. We let the process finish. I sat on my couch, the quiet of my apartment settling around me. For the first time in weeks, my phone was still. No messages, no demands, no accusations, just space. And in that space, I understood something I hadn't before. They didn't fear losing money. They feared losing the story where they were right and I was simply useful. And that story was already collapsing. The next hearing was scheduled in 10 days. And I knew whatever came out next would change things permanently. The first leak didn't come from the court. It came from church. I learned that on a Wednesday morning when my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Patricia Holloway, my father's older sister, who rarely contacted me unless there was something to be corrected. I hadn't heard from her in years. Her message was short. I didn't know. Is any of it true? I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. Yes, 3 letters. No explanation. Because once the truth reaches people who were never meant to hear it, the burden of explanation shifts. By Friday, the questions were everywhere. Not loud, not public. Private messages, side conversations, glances held a second too long. People my parents had known for decades were quietly recalibrating what they thought they understood. That kind of social shift doesn't announce itself. It whispers, and whispers travel faster than declarations. My mother called that night. People are talking, she said. Yes, I replied. She waited for more. I didn't give it to her. This is humiliating, she said finally. No, I said calmly. This is accurate. Silence. Then, you've always needed to be right. I almost laughed. I had never needed to be right. I had needed to be seen. Those are not the same thing. The second hearing approached faster than the first. This time, the tone was different. Daniel told me that opposing counsel had requested a settlement discussion. Quiet, off the record. They want to contain exposure, he said. And? I asked. And they're offering concessions, he replied. Limited oversight, partial restitution, family mediation. I thought about it. About the years of being assigned responsibility without authority, of being used as a solution while being denied a voice. No mediation, I said, and no private settlement. Daniel nodded. That's what I expected, he said, because mediation assumes equal footing. We had never been on equal footing. 2 days before the hearing, Ethan showed up at my apartment. This time, I opened the door. He looked different, not relaxed, not smug, tired. Can we talk? He asked. I stepped aside and let him in. He stood in the middle of my living room, like he didn't know where to put his hands. I didn't know, he said, about the loans, about your name. I believe you, I replied. That surprised him. You do? Yes, I said. You were never paying attention. That was your privilege. He swallowed. They're saying this could hurt me too, he said. That I might lose access. Support. Support you didn't earn, I said. He flinched. I'm not trying to fight you, he said. I don't want to lose everything. I studied him for a moment. Not with anger. With clarity. You won't lose everything, I said. You'll lose protection. He frowned. What's the difference? I met his eyes. Protection keeps you from consequences, I said. Support helps you survive them. He didn't respond. After a moment, he asked, What do you want? The question was genuine. I want the truth documented, I said. And the power imbalance correct? He nodded slowly. I don't think they'll forgive you, he said. I'm not asking them to, I replied. When he left, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. The second hearing was shorter, more procedural, less theatrical. The judge reviewed compliance, noted delays, issued warnings. Opposing counsel objected weakly. The record didn't support them. At one point, the judge looked directly at my father. Mr. Holloway, she said. You appear to have acted unilaterally in matters requiring consent. My father straightened. I did what I thought was best, he said. For whom? The judge asked. He didn't answer. The court ordered an independent forensic review, not a suggestion. An order. Outside the courtroom, reporters weren't waiting, but people were. Neighbors, old friends, church acquaintances. They didn't approach me. They watched. That was worse, because watching means reassessment. That night, Daniel called. This just got bigger, he said. How much bigger? I asked. Big enough that if more comes out, he replied. Your father's business may not survive it. I didn't respond immediately, not because I was conflicted, because I was acknowledging reality. I didn't cause this, I said finally. No, Daniel replied. You exposed it. There's a difference. I sat on my balcony that night. City noise drifting up from the street below. I thought about how long I had been quiet, how carefully, how professionally, and how that quiet had allowed everything else to grow unchecked. The story was breaking now. Not all at once, but enough. Enough that no one could pretend this was a misunderstanding. Enough that the roles we'd been playing no longer fit. The final hearing was scheduled for the end of the month, and I knew by then nothing would belong to the shadows anymore. The narrative shifted the week after the forensic review began, not in court, in public. It started subtly. A comment here, a suggestion there. People who had never asked me a single question suddenly seemed very sure they understood my motivations. I heard it first through Patricia Holloway, who called again, her tone cautious. "Your mother says you're being guided," she said carefully, "by lawyers. That you're doing this out of spite." I let the word settle. Spite was useful. It reframed evidence as emotion. "They need it to be personal," I replied. "Otherwise it's misconduct." Patricia didn't disagree. "They're saying you're angry," she said. "I'm organized," I replied. There was a pause on the line. "That's worse," she admitted. The smear wasn't loud enough to challenge directly. That was intentional. Loud lies can be disproven. Quiet doubt just lingers. At work, I felt it shift too. Not accusations, hesitations, a delayed approval, a meeting I wasn't looped into. Nothing overt enough to document, just enough to test whether I'd start reacting emotionally. I didn't. I documented everything. On Wednesday, Monica Reyes from HR asked if I had a moment. She closed the door gently behind her. "We received an anonymous concern," she said, "about your objectivity, given your family situation." I nodded. "I expected that," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "Did you?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. When accountability fails privately, people try reputational pressure. She studied me for a moment. "Do you want to respond formally?" she asked. "No," I said. "But I'll give you documentation if needed." She smiled faintly. "That would help," she said. It helped more than she realized. Because while my family was trying to paint me as unstable, the paper trail showed the opposite. Consistency, professionalism, calm. You can't discredit someone who never deviates. That night, Daniel called. "They're positioning you as the aggressor," he said. Classic reversal. "Will it work?" I asked. "Not legally," he replied. "But socially, it might buy them sympathy." "I'm not interested in sympathy," I said. "I know," he replied. "That's why this bothers them." The forensic review findings were released internally that Friday. Not to us, to the court. But Daniel had enough to summarize. Undisclosed liabilities, improper collateralization, breach of fiduciary duty, language that didn't accuse, it concluded. "Your father's attorney asked for time," Daniel said, "to prepare." "To do what?" I asked. "Control the fallout," he replied. That weekend, my mother sent me a letter, not an email, handwritten. She wrote about love, about intention, about mistakes made under pressure. She never once mentioned money, or my name on the loans, or the documents. At the end, she wrote one sentence that explained everything. "I don't recognize you anymore." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She had never recognized me when I was quiet, either. On Monday morning, I received a subpoena, not for testimony, for records, my records. Every transaction tied to my name, every payment, every account interaction going back 15 years. Daniel explained it calmly. "They're trying to spread responsibility," he said. "If they can show you benefited, even indirectly, they dilute liability." "Did I?" I asked. "No," he replied. "But they're hoping complexity creates doubt." It was the first time I felt something close to anger. Not explosive, focused. Because now, they weren't just defending themselves. They were trying to implicate me. I spent 3 nights pulling statements, organizing timelines, flagging inconsistencies. It felt familiar, like work, like every system I'd ever been asked to fix after someone else broke it. When I sent the files to Daniel, he called me immediately. "This is clean," he said. "Cleaner than I expected." "Because I never touched it," I replied. "That's going to matter," he said. The next day, my father requested a private meeting. Through his attorney, Daniel advised against it. "They're testing leverage," he said. "I want to hear what he says," I replied. The meeting was scheduled in a neutral office. No court, no witnesses. Just my father, his attorney, Daniel, and me. Thomas Holloway looked older than I remembered. Not weaker, smaller. "This has gone far enough," he said after the door closed. "You've made your point." "I didn't make a point," I replied. I responded to facts. His attorney interjected gently. "We believe this can still be resolved," she said, "without further damage." "Damage to whom?" I asked. Thomas leaned forward. "To all of us," he said. "You included." I met his gaze. "You didn't worry about that when you used my name," I said. He flinched. "We raised you to be capable," he said. "We trusted you." "You trusted my silence," I replied. The room went still. Daniel spoke then. "My client will not accept any agreement that avoids full disclosure," he said. "And she will not accept any narrative that assigns her shared responsibility." Thomas looked at me. "You're really going to do this," he said, "even if it ruins me." I thought about it. About everything. "I'm not ruining you," I said calmly. "I'm stepping out of the way." That was the moment he understood. Not that he might lose. That he already had. The final hearing was 3 days away, and this time they weren't preparing arguments. They were preparing exits. The week before the final hearing felt different. Not louder. Not more chaotic. Quieter. The kind of quiet that comes when people stop trying to win and start trying to survive. My father's business partner resigned on Tuesday. No announcement, no farewell email, just a quiet update on the company website that replaced his name with Interim Management Committee. By Wednesday, the bank requested revised disclosures. By Thursday, 2 long-standing clients paused contracts pending review. None of that was because of me. It was because once scrutiny begins, structures built on assumption collapse under their own weight. Daniel called me late Thursday afternoon. "They're hemorrhaging credibility," he said. "Not just legally, commercially." "I didn't contact anyone," I said. "I know," he replied. "That's why it's working." I went to see my grandmother that evening. Margaret Holloway was sitting in her armchair, a blanket folded neatly over her knees, the television muted. She looked up when I entered, her eyes sharp despite the fatigue. "They're calling old friends," she said, "asking for patience." "That's new," I replied. "They never asked for patience before," she said. "They demanded loyalty." She studied my face. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and meant it. Not because this was easy, because it was honest. The final hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. No testimony from me, no speeches, just conclusions. When we arrived, the courtroom felt heavier, not with tension, but with inevitability. Opposing counsel looked exhausted. My father sat alone this time. My mother was not there. Ethan was not there. Daniel leaned toward me as we took our seats. "That's intentional," he said quietly. "Isolation reads better than defense." The judge reviewed the forensic findings methodically. Improper use of collateral. Breach of fiduciary duty. Failure to disclose material information. Each finding landed without drama. Then came the ruling. Independent trustee appointed. Immediate removal of Thomas Holloway from any role involving estate oversight. Full restitution ordered to accounts tied to my name. Referral to regulatory bodies for review. Not criminal. Corrective. My father stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. When the judge finished, she looked up. "This court does not exist to manage family discomfort," she said. "It exists to correct misuse of authority." The gavel struck once. That was it. Outside the courtroom, no one rushed me. No accusations. No apologies. Daniel shook my hand. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," he said. "You let the system work." My phone buzzed as we walked to the car. A text from Ethan. "It just happened, didn't it?" I didn't reply, because there was nothing left to explain. That afternoon, the first article appeared. Not my name. My father's company. Language like governance review and leadership transition. No mention of family. But people who knew understood. By evening, my mother finally called. Her voice was flat. "They're asking questions," she said. "I know," I replied. "They want statements, explanations." "That's appropriate," I said. She was quiet for a long moment. "You never wanted to hurt us," she said finally. "No," I replied. "I wanted it to stop." She didn't argue. That was new. Over the next week, the fallout became visible. My father stepped down officially. The company announced restructuring. Clients returned slowly, cautiously. Ethan moved out of my parents' house. Margaret's estate was placed under professional management. Transparent, neutral, safe. One evening, Daniel called with a final update. "They're closing the case," he said. "No further action unless new evidence appears." "Thank you," I replied. "No," he said. "Thank you for not flinching." I sat alone in my apartment after that call, the city humming outside my window. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. The kind of finished that doesn't need applause. The kind that leaves space where pressure used to be. But I also knew something else. Ending control doesn't end consequence. It reveals it. And what came next wouldn't be decided in court. It would be decided in how each of them lived with what was now undeniable, including me. Because once you step out of a system built on your silence, you don't get to go back to who you were before. And I wasn't done becoming who I actually was. The first thing that surprised me was how little I was asked about the case once it was over. No one at work brought it up again. Monica Reyes didn't schedule a follow-up. My supervisor simply nodded once when I returned to routine meetings, as if to say, "We're good." That was the reward for not making noise. People trust what stays consistent. The second surprise was how empty my calendar felt. For years, my weekends had been shaped by family obligations. Dinners I attended out of duty. Calls I answered out of habit. Crises I absorbed because someone else didn't want to. When those obligations vanished, nothing rushed in to replace them. I had to choose. That took getting used to. Margaret Holloway recovered slowly but steadily. Physical therapy twice a week, fewer visitors, better sleep. "I don't feel anxious anymore," she told me one afternoon as we sat in her garden. I didn't realize how loud everything had been. I knew what she meant. Silence after control feels unfamiliar, like something's missing. Until you realize what's gone is the pressure. A week later, my mother sent me a message, not an apology, an update. "Your father is selling his interest. It's easier that way." Easier for whom was implied. I replied with one sentence, "I hope it brings clarity." She didn't respond. That was fine. At work, I was offered a promotion. Not a dramatic one, no announcement, no ceremony. A lateral shift with authority. Senior operations lead. Expanded oversight. Fewer approvals needed. I accepted without hesitation. Because this time, authority wasn't symbolic. It was written. That mattered. Ethan called me once more. He sounded unsure. "I'm starting from scratch," he said. "A real job. No safety net." "Good," I replied. "You're not angry?" he asked. "I'm not involved," I said. There was relief in his silence. Not for me. For him. Because without me absorbing impact, he would finally have to. That night, I cleared out my phone. Old threads, archived messages, contacts I hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't block anyone. I just stopped carrying conversations that only moved in one direction. On Sunday, I went back to my parents' house for the first time since the hearing. Not inside. Just the driveway. I dropped off a box of documents Daniel said they were entitled to. Copies. Nothing personal. My father wasn't home. My mother stood in the doorway. She looked smaller. "Do you want to come in?" she asked. "No," I replied gently. "I'm just here to return these." She nodded. "I didn't know how to stop it," she said suddenly. "I know," I replied. "That's why I had to." She swallowed. "I don't know who we are without the old rules," she said. "That's something you'll have to figure out," I replied, just like I did. She didn't ask me to stay. That was progress. As I drove away, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief, yes, but also permission. Permission to build a life not defined by fixing other people's failures. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need vindication. I needed separation. The hardest part wasn't exposing the truth. It was accepting that the truth wouldn't rebuild what never worked. And that was okay, because what I was building now didn't require anyone else's approval, only my own. Time didn't rush in to congratulate me. It settled. Days passed without disruption. Weeks without confrontation. The absence of conflict felt unfamiliar at first, like walking through a room where the hum of machinery had finally shut off and your ears hadn't adjusted yet. I noticed how often I reached for my phone without reason, not to call anyone, not to check messages, just to confirm nothing was wrong. Nothing was. Margaret Holloway's estate moved forward under the independent trustee with a kind of boring efficiency that felt almost luxurious. Monthly statements arrived on time. Decisions were documented. Questions were answered without defensiveness. That was what safety looked like. One afternoon, Margaret asked me to drive her to an appointment in Tarrytown. As I helped her into the car, she paused. "You know," she said, "your father hasn't asked about the trust once since the ruling." "That doesn't surprise me," I replied. "He asks about the weather," she said. "About my garden, not about money." She looked out the window as I drove. "I think he finally understands what it cost him." I didn't respond. Not because I disagreed. Because understanding doesn't repair damage. It just explains it. At work, my new role settled into something solid. Decisions moved faster. People came to me before problems escalated, instead of after. My authority wasn't questioned, because it wasn't borrowed from anyone else. I was no longer filling gaps someone else left behind. I was building something. One Friday afternoon, Monica Reyes stopped by my office. "I wanted you to hear this from me," she said. "There were conversations about whether your situation would affect your leadership." "And?" I asked. "And it didn't," she replied. "Because you handled pressure without destabilizing the team." She smiled slightly. "That's not common." After she left, I sat quietly for a moment, not proud, grounded. The recognition landed differently when it wasn't tied to survival. That weekend, I received a letter forwarded from my parents' address. It was from my father, handwritten, uncharacteristically brief. He wrote that stepping down had been harder than he expected, that he was learning what silence felt like when it wasn't imposed, that he hoped I was doing well. No apology, no defense, just observation. I folded the letter and placed it with the others. I wasn't collecting closure. I was archiving a chapter. Later that month, Ethan sent a message. "First day went okay. I didn't hate it." I replied with a single word: "Good." That was all he needed. I stopped being the reference point in their lives. And in that absence, something else emerged, my own. I started saying no more easily. Not with explanations, not with guilt, just no. I stopped volunteering for extra work, unless it aligned with what I was building. I stopped attending events out of obligation. I stopped explaining my boundaries as if they required justification. The world didn't collapse. It adjusted. One evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't waiting for the next conflict. I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head. I wasn't preparing to absorb impact. I was present. And that presence didn't need to be defended. The case was closed. The documents were filed. The system corrected itself. But the real shift happened afterward, when I chose not to step back into the role that had defined me for most of my life. The role of stabilizer, fixer, silent support. That role was gone now. And what remained wasn't emptiness. It was space. There was no moment where everything clicked into place. No sunrise epiphany. No sudden sense of arrival. What came instead was steadiness. Weeks passed, then months, and nothing dramatic happened. Which, I learned, was the point. A life built on clarity doesn't need constant correction. Margaret Holloway's health stabilized enough that she no longer needed daily check-ins. We spoke regularly, but not out of urgency, out of choice. One afternoon, as we sat in her living room, she said something I hadn't expected. "I'm proud of you," she said. Not for what I had done, for what I had refused to keep doing. "I didn't protect you when you were younger," she continued. "I thought letting you be capable would be enough." I didn't interrupt her. "I see now that capability without protection becomes permission for others to take," she said. "You stopped that." I nodded. Not because it felt like resolution, because it felt accurate. At work, the systems I put in place began to show results. Fewer emergencies, fewer last-minute corrections. People started planning instead of reacting. One of my team leads told me, casually, "Things feel calmer lately." That word again, calm. I used to think calm meant nothing was happening. Now I understood it meant things were working. My parents didn't try to pull me back in. There were no more surprise visits. No emotional appeals disguised as concern. Whatever dynamic had existed before no longer had a structure to stand on. Control needs access. They no longer had mine. I saw my mother once more that fall, at a distance, at a grocery store near her house. We exchanged polite nods. No confrontation, no tension, just acknowledgement. That was enough. Ethan sent me an update months later. Got promoted. Still figuring things out. I replied with 2 words. Keep going. I didn't mentor him. I didn't guide him. I didn't rescue him, and he didn't ask. That told me more than any apology could have. The strangest part was realizing how much of my identity had been shaped by resistance. By being the reasonable one, the dependable one, the one who absorbed pressure so others didn't have to. When that role disappeared, I had to ask myself who I was without it. The answer wasn't dramatic. I was someone who liked quiet mornings. Someone who did her job well and left it at the office. Someone who chose her relationships carefully and didn't negotiate her worth anymore. That was enough. One evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea, I thought about the version of myself who had walked into that law office months earlier and sat outside a room where her future was being decided without her. She hadn't been weak. She had been trained. Trained to accept erasure as efficiency. Trained to confuse usefulness with belonging. What changed wasn't my strength. It was my consent. I didn't rebuild my family. I didn't punish them. I didn't seek revenge. I stopped participating in a system that required my silence to function. That choice had consequences for them and for me, but only one of us gained something lasting from it. If you've ever been told to stay quiet to keep the peace, to step back because someone else mattered more, to accept less because you were strong enough to handle it, understand this. Strength does not obligate you to be consumed. Loyalty does not require self-erasure. And family does not get to define your value by how useful you are to their comfort. You don't need to burn bridges. You don't need to win arguments. Sometimes the most controlled form of revenge is simply refusing to carry what was never yours. If this story resonated with you, if you recognize pieces of your own life in it, like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Not for the drama, for the moment when choosing yourself finally becomes the only option left.